Okay, welcome to my VATE conference presentation, because survival is insufficient and the fancy graphic is impressive to me at least. Just to acknowledge, obviously, presenting this on Indigenous land, the original storytellers, and coming to you from the land of the Wurundjeri people, and I recognise that we are on unceded Indigenous land and recognise elders past, present and emerging. So this presentation is, as it's a video, it makes a lot of sense. Instructional video for annotation, deeper reading, all those sort of things. I'm going to foreground the instructional video component at the start, just so that you can kind of understand the process of getting that done, because otherwise the annotation and deeper reading actual content is probably a little bit harder to grasp without understanding the methodology that lies behind it and how you might actually produce a video of your own. I would suggest, we've all been remote learning, that it's very possible to slightly alter the way you're already doing things during remote learning to make an instructional video that will be an artifact that you'll be able to retain from now until when you hopefully return back to face-to-face teaching, and also leverage in your remote learning. So this slide I'm looking at right now is deeply important to me because this is as a pre-recorded presentation. I don't have any opportunity for any feedback. We could have people in the imaginary audience asleep or not watching at all. And so if you could reach out on any of those channels or forms, or just search for my name on the internet, you'll find some kind of a reference to me or where I live or how you contacted me on the online space. And I would really appreciate if you could do that, because otherwise I'm simply sitting in a room talking to myself, which is something I do far too often, but isn't ideal. As it says here, ask me about instructional video, flipped learning, teachers across borders Australia. We do development work in Cambodia, training teachers, usually Australian teachers, Swedes, and a couple of US teachers go over there and run development workshops that I'm heavily involved with. And EduReading is an academic reading group that I run that I'm always looking for more teachers to engage with. So just to do a bit of contexty stuff, as we all know, we've been remote learning for, someone recently told me that Victorian teachers have been doing remote learning for the longest of anyone in the world. So take that for something that's quite useful, I think. If you think of the sort of intellectual property we as Victorian teachers will have, being able to say we've done remote learning for the longest at the K-12 sector, of course, for the longest of anyone, I think that's a very useful and powerful thing. So just going to contextualize our presentation in that sense. And so to me, the four elements of remote learning are offline stuff, having an LMS, using instructional video, and our video conferencing, whatever you use, Google, Microsoft, whatever it is. To me, the important element there is instructional video, because unless you're recording your sessions with your students, which you probably shouldn't be based on what we know about the various policies, or doing some clever editing, which is possible to remove students and edit them out and cut them out and things like that, then next year or next term, whenever we return to face-to-face teaching, those artifacts are gone. They're ephemeral, they are synchronous, and therefore they are gone, just as speaking out loud in a class is. Whereas instructional video obviously it can live on forever, theoretically at least. And so I at least at our school and in my practice, this is something I try and leverage a great deal of. In terms of engagement, I've got here engagement, connection and collaboration, because those are the three most challenging elements of remote learning in my opinion, and I've written articles about it to convince other people that that is the case. And I'm not saying instructional video solves any of these issues, of course, it certainly doesn't, but it is by and large a little bit more engaging than a worksheet or a booklet or a PowerPoint that students are simply delivered rather than talked through. So there's a bit of a blurb of the actual topic that we're speaking about here. I'm not going to go into detail about it because I'm trying to sort of step you through it as we go. But it's basically, why instructional video? We're going to start with the easy question, why should you do it? And I'm going to try and convince you at the very least. So everyone in digital innovation, teaching, online teaching, they always talk about the TPAC model, teaching, pedagogical knowledge, technological knowledge, pedagogical knowledge and content knowledge as a Venn diagram that interweaves and interlaps. And it's always felt a bit silly to kind of say, oh, technology is part of it, believe me, whether you can use laptops with your students or whether you are able to use Flipgrid or Kahoot or simple apps like that, has an impact on your pedagogy and your content. And I was just on a panel last night with a digital learning expert such as myself, and she was saying that the best innovation that she's seen in terms of the digital comes from teachers who already have that content knowledge. They've got that pedagogical knowledge, and then when you add in the technological piece or the technology piece, then you have something really useful to build on, because they rely on one another. And if you don't know the content, obviously the way you'll be using technology is probably just something that isn't necessarily that deep or that useful. Whereas if you have strong content and pedagogical knowledge, you can have a look more critically at technological tools or even instructional videos we're talking about now, and start to think, is that relevant to my content? Where can I use it, and how does it fit with my broader pedagogy? So the actual pedagogy I use is probably beyond the scope of this presentation, but I found it pretty dramatically valuable to challenging and changing my pedagogy and allowing more student voice, student empowerment. Student-centric classes as an idea is something that I think a lot of us aspire to, but due to the time poverty of being a teacher in the modern world, that doesn't happen. For me, if I convert some of my direct teaching into video, I've found being able to find small sections, little wedges of time where I'm actually able to do the kind of stuff that gets us excited. Real debates, real sort of shared annotation, the fun stuff that we maybe get to once a year if we've got a really switched on class. So that's my why. So as I've listed here, I'm going to be glancing slightly downwards to check my notes, but teacher flexibility, it's more accessible. I've just finished a chapter about instructional video for inclusion, and there's a whole bunch of reasons that of the research that backs this up, and I'll explain that pretty briefly in a second. Obviously not everyone's sort of as into research as I am, so I'm going to fly through that relatively quickly, but just know that if you have EAL students, students with dyslexia, or students who are low literacy, generally, as a general rule, and the vast generalization here, listening, their oral capabilities are almost certainly more advanced than their reading. And to me anyway, that's what I've noticed and been able to establish through my own classes and my own practice. I don't have stats to back that one up, but that's a belief that I hold to firmly. And so I've found with students with dyslexia, especially in the VCE years, this is a really good way to allow them to independently engage with texts via listening to them or seeing a kind of worked example of the process of writing or annotating or engaging with the text itself. So it allows you to assist multiple students at once. So the idea of kind of cloning or reproducing teachers is a little bit science fiction-y, but this is the closest we can do with the technology we have now, to have students at different levels receiving different types of instruction from me, the teacher, rather than from someone else. And yeah, superior to other forms of learning resources. So as much as I would love to say that worksheets are the be-all and end-all, it is my belief, and from what I've read of research at least, this is supported by the multimedia theory, that if it comes in through the eyes and the ears, that's better than just coming in through the eyes, especially because essentially reading is a process of looking at words and reading them out loud in your head and hearing them in your ears. So providing visual support for that, as with perhaps this slide is a terrible example, but providing visual things to support what you're talking about, and as much as possible sort of spatial things, like when I was speaking about TPAC, kind of gesturing with my hands to mimic the Venn diagram and make the information spatial for your students is very important. So research basis, again, as promised, it's there if you want to chase it up. Cognitive load theory gives us the multimedia principle and gives us probably the best information that we have available on up-to-date what we understand the brain to be able to do, short-term memory, long-term memory, 7+2 things can be held in short-term memory for a neurotypical student or adult, and we have to sort of keep that in mind when we produce videos and teach and whatever. I'm not going to talk about it. Multimedia cognitive load theory, I could again go into Fiorella and Mayer in more detail, but essentially there's a whole bunch of principles when you are making a video And this is a good example of redundancy because I'm speaking information that is also on the screen, and that's an example of redundancy which is hard to avoid, but I think an understanding of multimedia cognitive load theory is something that supports us as presenters, teachers, people that communicate to students, the things that we should and should not be doing. And so this is something that I quite often speak about, and it's often quite amusing to have the redundancy principle being explained as it is now, whilst also it is occurring. So, sort of doing the wrong thing while explaining the right thing is often what happens in teaching. Flipped learning, again, that's a pedagogy, so I tend not to talk about it at great length, but I've done all the courses, read all the books, even contributed to some of the courses on flipped learning. I wouldn't call what I do a full flip, which involves all of the content being delivered via video rather than direct instruction, but it's definitely something that I think we could all aim to aspire to do, potentially, to allow more freedom in our class and more human engagement. We've got video modelling special ed. This is definitely beyond the scope of here, but very similar approach to instructional video, but it happens as special ed. Assistive technology, so that's where the idea about including all students through video comes from. And universal design for learning, I hope everyone has heard of and is aware of, and it's my belief that video is a key important part of that, and if you put the right things in place, allow different playback speeds and captioning and those sort of things, closed captions or some other version, if you allow all those things, then these can be universally designed for learning so that all can access equally, which is why it's not an intervention aimed at a particular group, but it's one that can be applied equally to different groups of need and support their work. Alright, so I don't know why I still show this graph, but basically this is the multimedia, the multimodal theory diagram. This is the best one I could find. I'm not actually going to talk through it, but basically trust me, if it's coming through the eyes and the ears, it's better. And this diagram kind of goes into a bit of detail about how to do that, but I won't pull it apart here. The reference is probably floating around if you want to read it later. So, as I said before, video is superior to all these forms. I'm not going to dwell on that. So the question of how do you actually do it is of course an important one for teachers, and normally I'd run workshops and whole half-day, whole-day sessions on this and how to do it, but fortunately we've all basically been doing it. If you start a Google, Microsoft Teams, Meet, whatever you want to call it, WebEx, if you start a meeting and just start talking natively in that platform whilst you've clicked record, then you've just recorded your first instructional video. That's obviously not the best way, but if it's a way that you're familiar with, give it a go, see how it works. Typically in the current context and paradigm, for me this looks like when my students are off working on a task and I'm providing feedback to their written instruction, then rather than repeatedly copy and paste the same error that I'm noticing, I would just click record and start making a short video, as I've just done yesterday on comparative paragraphs. So students have a tendency to say both in their topic sentence, which in my opinion completely ruins the entire purpose of comparison, because if you're choosing between two things and you say both, as lovely as that is for an academic argument, it doesn't really give you much bite to actually pursue. So don't really know why I just explained that, but here we are. So these are the modes. Basically, if you can open camera on any app or device that you have, you're good to go. Teams, Google Meet, as I've said, just click record. You can do it with students in there or without. Obviously, if you have students in the meeting and they're speaking or they're displayed, you're going to have to work around how to edit them out and kind of cut out sections, which is something you probably don't necessarily have the skill set to do. So I would suggest just avoiding that and doing a meet without anyone in there. I personally use OBS, or Online Broadcaster Software Studio. Who knows exactly what it's called, but the website is there, obsproject.com. This is free. There are alternative Screencast-O-Matic, Screencastify that people might be more familiar with. They both cost money. This one does not, and it's open source. If you type, the name of the software into YouTube, there's thousands of videos of predominantly teenagers and young adults explaining how they use it to stream their favorite video game and all those sort of things. So there's a lot of support out there for a relatively naive teacher like us to sort of just look at a program and think that looks complicated. But you know, if students younger than those that most of us probably teach are able to use this tool for their own purposes, and so we should probably give it a go as well. If you're a Microsoft person, as our school is, you can now record natively within Stream as well as within PowerPoint. So they're both options, and this is increasingly something that's happening with a whole range of tools and platforms. They're including options for how to do this easily, so it's becoming increasingly easy for me to explain to people how to do this. Flipgrid might be a useful tool if you want to get your students to record short videos in response to things. So I've used this for things like essay planning, where I ask my students to record a really short video explaining their ideas for their essay plan, and then I can just snap off a quick response video from my phone or whatever I've got and just say, great, when you're talking about this, maybe comment on that and focus on this thing and remember your techniques. So really target it to what they're talking about. Whereas if they were to just type it, for me, I always try and focus on oracy first, so students can communicate their idea and then turn it into words later. That's, from what I know of literacy, that's the best way forward, especially for low literacy students, and Flipgrid is one of the ways that I'm able to facilitate that. If you want to stuff around it, you can add Snapchat filters to your video. There's me in a fake horn helmet, and my wife recorded a video of her and I reading out a poem about Spider-Man, and so that's an example of little silly things you can do. If you have a nice DSLR, as I think some of us might, just sitting there, you can now connect that up to your computer using just a USB connection and use it as a DSLR sort of webcam if you have a Canon product. So for me at my school, this is the sort of stuff that we get up to. We've got things that obviously I don't have access to currently, but we've got a whole bunch of different things that we can use. So we use a light board that's like a whiteboard but made out of glass, lit from the side. As you can see in this picture, I built it myself, so it's pretty tall because I'm 2 meters tall. And also some green screen stuff like what I'm doing now, and podcasting equipment and a swivel so we can do in-class sort of demonstrations of teaching. I'm going to give you sort of a bit of a flying tour of what this room looks like, because we've spent a fair bit of work on it. Derek Lenny, the Learning Technologies leader at my school, and myself have sort of been tinkering away with it. So it's got a whole bunch of sort of a help zone where you can go and work out how to do things. This is the green screen. This is Derek himself talking through classical and operant conditioning and showing off the green screen and why you might do it. As I said before, the sort of spatial elements are important. This is our assistant principal speaking about nutrition, and our principal here giving her address for term 3 to students about what we proposed for remote learning to make it a bit better. You can sort of stuff around with it, do silly things like that, add video behind, which is what I'm doing now, of course. And you can sort of see we're a government school, so we did this without any large budget. It's not a costly thing. It's just knowing the right way to set things up. You can see there's sort of lighting, we've got backdrops and things like that that are not necessary, of course, but like anything as a teacher, once you start investing in a certain strategy or a certain idea, you start to become quite good at it. At least that's the hope anyway. And so this is the light board in action, and just me stuffing around to giving you an idea of why you might use it. And mostly it's maths and science teachers. For English, I haven't found really too much use for it, mostly for talking about sort of paragraph structure, how you might approach an essay, and trying to just give students, mostly lower level students, give them a really clear idea of sort of why they write and what shape it should perhaps take, which of course is not the best way to teach writing, but it is a way to support the lower students. So, and then just in terms of making do, some of these are mine, some of these are just ones that I found online of people doing instructional videos in sort of cheap budget ways. Some of these are a little bit costlier, of course, but this is the kind of stuff that gets me excited, especially my colleagues over in Cambodia are doing very similar things with just mobile phones and a tripod and a little microphone, and presenting lessons for them, the whiteboard of their class that then their students can access while they're not at school. So obviously you don't need a whiteboard or a light board or a green screen or anything like that. You've got all the tools just sitting probably in your pocket or on your desk if you are using your laptop. You can do all these things with those, but this is just sort of examples of how people have used it for demonstrations, for example. So you can set it up for a science experiment, and you can do The middle one is annotation. I've got a slightly better solution that costs a bit of money, but if you put your phone on some kind of a ruler above a piece of text, that's completely fine, and then that's the way that you can do what we used to call, I guess, sort of transparencies or overheads or something like that. This is a sort of taxonomy. The blue represents things that do not need editing, which are the things that I propose are things that you should definitely focus on if you are just starting out, and avoid editing at all costs. So the thing that I'm doing while I'm presenting this is I'm not stuffing up, at least I hope I'm not, and so what I won't be doing is editing. And so if there's a moment where I pause or stuff up or look off into the distance and make a stupid face, I'm going to leave that in. And this is my approach to video because I've been doing it for, at this point, 4 years. Of course, you are not in that situation necessarily yourself, so you might want to, if you stuff it up and make a swear or make an obvious error or say the wrong name or forget the name of a character and look a bit silly, you're just going to stop recording and start again from the top. And I've done this for many years, and that's always been the best way. Learning how to edit was sort of a fun side project, but by and large, whatever I do, no matter how stupid I look, is what the students see, because no matter what happens, I'm still their teacher and they're kind of stuck with me anyway. So I've got here where, so then the question is, you've made a video, you've recorded a meeting with just you in it, or however you've set it up is entirely up to you. You've done some sort of an annotation video with your camera above some text. How do you do it? And so we've got kind of 4 steps. Pre-production, which is, you get stuff ready, you've got your PowerPoint, you've got your notes, you've got your book, whatever you've got, pencils, pens, highlighters, whatever you need for your video, demonstration, whatever it is. Then you've got production, you're filming it, you're recording it. Editing is an optional step, or post-production. You might want to turn up the audio if it's too low, or do little small tweaks like that. And then you have to produce it, or make it available to your students. There's a whole bunch of different ways you can do that. ClickView is available to all Victorian students. Microsoft Stream if you're a Microsofty person. Google Classroom, you can check it up there. My preference is always YouTube, because then not just your students but other students can access it, and ClickView would be the same. If you get to a certain level of making videos of this kind, you can set up your own little channel on ClickView and they'll kind of promote you as a featured teacher, presenter, I'm not exactly sure. So that might be a good way to get your work out there more broadly. And if you're at a VATE conference at the moment, that might be something that you're thinking about, because you're probably not just thinking at the standard level of just teaching in a class, but maybe thinking a little bit bigger. And as the title of the presentation and the conference is a little bit more than survival, to me the way that we do better than just survive this pandemic is cling to instructional video to a certain extent, and find a way to kind of mix it in, cohese it to, that's not a word, cohese it to our everyday actions and teaching. So no need to edit, just stop and restart is my big thing. If you must, Premiere Pro is, Victorian teachers have a license for this, so if you ask your IT people, they can sort you out for it for free or for a very small cost if not. Camtasia is the product I use. Costs a little bit, maybe $300 odd, but the reason I use it is it's simple as using PowerPoint, but you're editing video, and that is definitely not the case for other products out there. Adobe Spark, you can edit an entire video on your phone, which is something that might be useful. Just add a title at the start, add some text beside your head as you talk, those sort of things, really simple improvements. Add music underneath if you're really uncomfortable with the sort of silence that might occur in your video. That's one way to do it. So here we're going to pivot, and I'm going to check the time to see how I'm doing to make sure I'm not talking for too long. Not there, great, 24, heading just about right. So annotation 4. This is, I'm going to glance down and read this, because this is from an article that I published in Idiom, and it really helped me to sort of coalesce what I've been doing for, at this point, about 4 years into something a little bit clearer. So this is why you might use it. Actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause and give you a second to actually read the slide rather than reading it out loud, as that is the best way. So I'm going to pause. Okay, so those are the forms of videos that I make for my students using instructional video. And you'll see annotation is a really big focus there, and that's the focus of this session, of course, but not to exclude other forms and other approaches. What I then did, and this is some theory of how it might work, the approach that I've always thought about is that in an English class, the massive gap that we have between those most able students and those less able is that we rely on our students completing a reading of often quite a complex text, quite a long text, from a genre that they may not be familiar, or from a historical period that they may not be familiar with at all. We require them to do that at home, usually during the holidays, usually during the summer holidays, so over Christmas, when there is no teacher present. And so this has always been, to me anyway, this is the core issue of English teachers. We give them full support and full knowledge, and we help them as much as we can when we're there, but a very large portion of the work, if we're going to consider it as work in a capitalist mindset, the reading of the text, the engagement with the text, the reading that we hope to happen in a deep way, happens when we're not there. We're off enjoying a teacher holiday, whatever that means for you. For me, that means more or less doing the same thing but without the classes. So, you know, take that for what that's worth. But the students are doing it by themselves. And so a lot of this wheel of the curriculum wheel, the pedagogical wheel, is about getting students through the context, getting them familiar with the work, and then getting them to writing. So I don't make a lot of videos on the kind of mimicking of style or the writing process, because usually, and so I mean that's a lie, there are short micro skill videos of topic sentences and, you know, using quotes and ways that you should think about your comparative paragraph structure, but those are often ad hoc. So my students are doing a certain thing, and the video is kind of one of my interventions to steer the direction of the class closer to the actual genre that they're trying to produce. So just to go back to the core problem, to me, making videos available to students is the best way I've been able to do it. In the past, you know, we've done a lot of booklets and, you know, fill in this question and, answer what happened on this page, and comprehension questions as a rookie teacher used to be kind of just what was accepted practice. That you would give the kids the book, they would read it at home, and then you'd smash them with some kind of droll and boring comprehension questions to kind of check to prove that they'd read it. Not that they'd read it deeply, mind you, but just that they'd read it and they knew the characters and what happened in chapter 2 and all those sort of things. So my solution is to make an annotation guide video, which I'll get to in a second, that gives them sort of, it kind of front loads the vocabulary, front loads the ideas, tells them what they're looking out for. So for me, as a simple example, if my students are reading To Kill a Mockingbird, I'd rather them know in advance, what's the point of the mockingbird? Why are we talking about killing a mockingbird? That's a pretty strange title. So I'd talk about motif and symbol and what it represents, and I'd talk about the themes, and I'd try and contextualize them as much as I could before I let them run free and read the book by themselves without any further support. And usually what I do is make an annotation video of the first couple of chapters where I do the process that I expect them to follow, which is annotating their book, highlighting, writing things, taking notes. So hence the focus is on what I think of as the biggest challenge for English teachers, getting students to read the book, 1, and getting the students to read the book 2, deeply, so actually to understand it and to be really making connections. So that's the challenge. So what I did may only be interesting to me, but I really had a great time. And again, I'm going to pause to give you some time to read this rather than read it out loud, but then I'll give you a bit of a summary of what it means and how I've used it. Okay, so yeah, 604 videos total for the last 4 years of teaching. That is a lot, and I'm a little bit concerned about my approach as a result. But these numbers are indicative of where I put my focus, and you can see that annotation guides were at about 60 and annotation videos were at about 113. So to me, one of the core skills of students is reading texts, obviously, but that's harder to teach. and the annotation process of actually making meaning from that text. So this has always been my thing, and you can see 113 videos means basically that I'm doing what I've asked you or suggested that you could do, which is recording a page that I read. I don't read it out loud, mind you. That would be an audiobook. You can see the numbers on that are quite small. Firstly because it's hard, and secondly because it takes ages, and thirdly because it's not that useful to, in my experience, for my students. I know there's a lot of teachers that do this thing on YouTube, so you can find them and usually save yourself having to do it. So the annotation videos are important because that's me modeling what I expect. So anytime I give my students the idea of annotation, the first thing we have to get through is that seems weirdly, sacrilegious. We can't write on a book, this is my book, or the idea of, well, I bought this book secondhand, so it's already been annotated, so my job is done, I don't have to do any of the thinking. Thank you very much, sir. But I'll avoid doing that, thank you, it's already been done. And this is my 10th year teaching, and so quite often what happens for me is that the students have bought a second-hand book and it's annotated in the exact way that I'm asking them to annotate, because I've been around for long enough that that's the sort of thing that culturally happens. And so that poses the actual problem of then you have that discussion with students of, well, have you actually thought about it? Have you done the thinking work required to actually write and to think about this text properly? And then of course the hard part is getting them to re-annotate or de-annotate or fix up the annotations of whoever came before them. So just an idea of the kind of options that are there and the focus that I have. You might have a different focus, you might have a different cohort, almost certainly you'll have a different cohort, almost certainly you'll have a different focus and a different sort of pedagogical goal that you have for your students. Mine is very much to get them reading deeply and doing a lot of that during the holidays to allow for the kind of stuff that gets me excited, which is discussion and debate and getting students sort of fired up and speaking for and against the kind of ideas the author puts forward. So why annotation guides to me, and this is from a forthcoming article for AATE. To me there's something just kind of, I don't know, primordial, essential about writing, scribbling, even graffiti. I mean, you can go back to way back when, the Roman times, and find examples of graffiti occurring. And as this quote tells us, sometimes for students, the writing in the notes is the fun part. And if I think of my more critical moments of reading, that's definitely the case. My response, my reader response, is more important than the text itself. So to me, that's where it comes from. There's something innately to it. If I think of my students engaging with this process, there's a certain element to it that cannot be kind of from me or from them. It's sort of something like, okay, great, a teacher has asked me, oh captain, my captain, to tear up my books almost, to deface them, to highlight them, to put sticky notes in them, to fold pages, to really engage with the book, throw it around, and obviously that's a certain positioning of the student in relation to the book, rather than the book as holier than thou and above. This is the students very much as kind of recipients, engagers, people that are heavily involved in the process of reading rather than merely reading for reading's sake. So we're going to go through a really short example just to give you, again, this is very idiosyncratic to what I want my students to write about, how I want them to be thinking. And it's quite, people often speak against the teal or the peel structure to essay writing. I could quite believe that people would disagree with the way that I am sort of leading my students to think in a certain way. But in my experience, having the students have a consistent approach to annotation is way better than sending them off on their own sort of personal reading journeys, simply because this allows us to foreshadow language and to have a common language of analysis. So rather than one student saying, oh, for me the theme of this book was religion, and for another student saying, oh, for me it was spirituality, those things aren't the same. And so if we then have a discussion around those two themes, the students are coming from a very different place, and it's hard to sort of bring their kind of focus to their ideas. So that's why I do this the way I do it. I've read a lot of articles on different approaches to annotation, more student-led, more teacher-led, more kind of dictated, more dictatorial even. But for me, this is the way that fits best with my character, with my profession, my understanding of the world, and sort of how I act on it. So this is I've got here Year 9 example, but technically it's a Year 8 SEAL class or an accelerated class, but essentially for all rights and reasons. It's a Year 9 text, and we're doing sort of Year 9 level work. So this is my annotation guide. We go through themes. So again, it's important to me that we have a consistent set of themes, and we can obviously, a big theme like leadership, the idea for me is that all of these 4 themes should cover all of the things within the book. We don't want to be adding more than 4, because to me a pack of highlighters comes in 4 and each one gets a colour, and it's important to me to have that as a consistent expectation, that then students can share sort of their annotations with others and so forth. Then we have motifs, and this of course will change. This is an accelerated group, Year 8/Year 9 to kind of crossover. For a Year 7 text we'd just do themes, motifs and symbols, and that would be it. And if the students could comment on motifs and symbols in their writing at the end of a unit, I would be very impressed. But also there's, I guess, the idea of, it's also co-constructed. So for example, you might think, well, Lord of the Flies aren't in that book, I'm an English teacher, who doesn't? You've got a very small number of symbols there, and indeed I do. And of course the idea is then to say to the students, oh, is there a symbol that I missed? And then if a student were to say, well, yes, there is in fact the symbol of the mountain, or whatever they want to say, whatever they want to add, and then as a whole class we would then say, oh, that's really useful, everyone, we're all going to go to the front page of our book, which is where this sort of scribbling lives, and we're going to add the symbol that a student has told us. And so let's all do that, and then that student has their thinking empowered, and they're thinking a bit more critically than just accepting what I'm proposing in and of itself. So we've got readings here. This is kind of literary theory that may not happen depending on the cohort that you've got until maybe Year 11, Year 12, maybe even first year uni, you might leave it out. But for these students I found this useful to give them sort of frames of reference. Character allegories, of course, is something that's implicit within the text. For me, any annotation guide will be different based on the text. Intertextual references, again, to foreshadow, because they won't have the knowledge necessarily of what Robinson Crusoe is. I only vaguely do myself, but just to sort of situate them in the kind of parallels that they're trying to draw, the author is trying to draw between that text and his own. And then there's probably something to this, but the video on the left is the annotation guide. It's probably produced around the same time as the video on the right. It's got about, 1,600 views. I only know that because I checked it just beforehand. The one on the right hand side has about 16,000 views, and so to me, students would love it if I just annotated every chapter and they could hear all of my ideas, but it's very important to me to leave gaps and to only do a certain amount of chapters to get students the idea of how it's modelled, and then to let them free to actually do their own thinking. And so that's why the annotation guide, though less popular, is to me very important. And then just for a little example, so these are student created examples. So on the right hand side, that is a student sort of explanation of an annotation guide. At this point of the year, I believe they'd sort of seen how I did mine and they did their own, and they had different symbols and themes and motifs, and we had a discussion of why that was and what that meant. The video on the left is a live annotation, so we filmed it for students that weren't there and so forth, but the entire class was there in the room watching it on the projector, and they were copying the annotation. So this is unlisted, so it's hard to find, which is the idea, but this is a very useful way of kind of building on experience. So the year that followed, I did the same thing but with a different class that already watched the previous year's annotations, and they're starting to add detail and complexity to it. Alright, so that kind of concludes my instructional video, why I believe you should do it, how it might be useful, how you might go about it, where you might upload it. We talked a little bit about my specific method and methodology, my thinking for annotation and deeper reading. Now this is kind of, if this has piqued your interest at all, there's something called the Teaching Online Masterclass that's only being published just as of September 1st that I was able to contribute to, as well as a number of teachers, educators and researchers around the world. I highly commend you to go have a look at that, because that's what my weekend will be, watching that and seeing how they've sort of put my ideas together with others and how it all blends together to, I guess, come up with a bit of a general methodology or approach to online teaching. This one's forthcoming. I did some work with ClickView, doing probably a much better produced version of what I'm doing now, and a much shorter, so I think it's 6 videos total. Each one is between 3 and 7 minutes, so very short. So just keep an eye out for that if that's something that you're interested in. Again, it'll be probably much more succinct than this. If you are a reader, which I certainly would hope that you are, so this is the I don't know why it says July 30th. Oh yeah, that's when it was published. I wrote 2 articles in the most recent edition of Idiom, one with Emma Entiquette, who is a first-year English teacher who has the misfortune of teaching during remote learning in her first year in a rural school. And we wrote something about connecting with your tribe online on Twitter. So if you want to read that, or instructional video for the middle years, which is sort of some of the content we've just talked about here, but a little bit more research backed and those sort of things, that's worth doing. There's also, if you flip learning is something you've often thought about doing, there's a Flip Learning Global Initiative course that you can go to at flgi.org, I believe is the link, but you probably just Google Flip Learning. The Level 1 course includes me among 39 other experts in the instructional video flip learning field from around the world. I highly recommend that. It's worth paying for. I've probably done it three separate times as they've improved it over multiple years. On the right hand side is a Monash course, again I contributed to, but mostly Matt Fifield and other academics from Monash talking about instructional video and online interactivity, and it's definitely worth a watch. It's more of a reader version than the other ones we've spoken about, which are of course, as you might imagine, more video based, but it gives you references to read and discussions to do. Almost at the end. Educational Research Reading Room is a podcast run by Ollie Lovell. He did an entire series on remote learning and online teaching. Likewise, the Teachers Education Review is a podcast I contribute to. Likewise, did an entire section on online learning. That might be worth listening to if you're more of a listener than a reader at times. And those are sort of the links you can follow up for those courses. And thus concludes my presentation. As I've just said, it's a one-sided me talking to a camera, so if you want to reach out and connect with me in any way, I would greatly appreciate that, because otherwise I will not know that anyone other than myself has seen or heard this presentation. So thank you for your time and your attention, and I look forward to being in touch with you in the future. Cheers.